The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
There are times when property owners may consider other ways to own and manage their properties, especially when they're ready to move on from the hands-on aspects of property management. Today, we'll hear from a group of people who will provide education about these different options. The content will be heavy, so if you have pen and paper or an electronic device, I suggest that you take notes. We will also provide visual aids via email and on our website. During the presentation, you'll also see writing at the bottom of the screen every now and then telling you how to access more detailed information. But even with all of these options, it's important to remember that we're still faced with a lot of hostile threats against property rights on Beacon Hill. Therefore, to exercise these choices, it's more important than ever for all of us to come together to defend property rights for all housing providers in Massachusetts. Hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to episode 7 of our series about housing policy and property rights, brought to you by the Small Property Owners Association, also known as SPOA. My name is Amir Shahsavari. I'm the Vice President of SPOA, and today I'm happy to introduce Ms. Christina Dorobek, who is the Head of Investor Relations at Groma. With her is Mr. Brian Butler, who is a member of the Capital Markets and Acquisitions Team. I'm happy to have both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Amir. We're thrilled to be here.
And we have Mr. Demetrios Salpoglou, who is a housing advocate, a property owner, and a broker. He is the CEO of Boston Pads. Demetrios, it's great to have you back on.
Thanks for having me again.
So I'd like to begin by thanking everyone who has supported us thus far, all of you who have followed our email chains and our updates. It's been a pretty eventful past several weeks. We were emailing all of our members about different threats that are out there involving the transfer tax proposal, another proposal involving limiting credit checks for potential tenants, background checks. We heard about a recent amendment to the governor's housing bond bill with regard to TOPA. And that's for those of you who might not remember, we've talked about it extensively before. It stands for Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. It's also referred to as Tenant Right of First Refusal. So what happens if you want to sell your property once you've made an agreement with a potential buyer? If TOPA were implemented, it would allow a tenant association to interfere with that sale and to delay it. Theoretically, the tenants are supposed to have time to match the buyer's offer, but what has ended up happening in the past is that it created significant delays, blocking the process, discouraging the potential buyer to the point where he or she would withdraw the offer. And then the tenant associations and other third parties would try to pressure the owner to bring his or her price down to a level that was unrealistically low. And that would eventually fall through. And to make matters worse, if the seller wanted to move on to another prospective buyer, the tenant association could come back and start that vicious cycle all over again. And it failed in Washington, D.C. It did not help the people it was supposed to help. Less than 5% of tenants in D.C. wound up purchasing the properties that they rented. And it's not fair. It's not fair to all the property owners who have invested a great deal in their properties for the purpose of having a retirement savings. And there are circumstances where people might need to sell their properties quickly in order to cash out their retirement or to spend the money on healthcare costs for themselves and their loved ones. And so it amounts to a hijacking, in other words. It's not fair to the seller. It's not fair to a lot of average buyers who want to invest. It turns all the good people who could be good property owners, good landlords, it discourages them, it turns them away. If it benefits anyone, it likely benefits third-party speculators from outside the state who are very, very large corporations. And, you know, I could go on about it. You can go to our website, you can read our articles. It just doesn't help. It scares the banking industry away. It's bad for investments. So please kindly contact your state representatives and senators and say no. Tell them that you're against it. And there'll be more to come on this later. But, you know, we're here for you to warn you about these potential threats. And so that's why it's important to donate to SPOA. You can do that by going to www.spoa.com/join. I have to remind all of you that we're a group of volunteers. You know, we set our free time aside to testify on your behalf at hearings at the State House, hearings at the city level. We bring you newsletters, we bring you productions like this, email updates. So we definitely need you to be involved and to participate and to help, because we can't do it alone. It's our pleasure to do it, but we definitely need all of you. So please remember to go to spoa.com/join. And with that, I will turn it over to Christina and Brian. And before we talk about the UPREIT program and 1031 exchanges, can you tell us a little bit about Groma and what Groma does?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Amir, thanks again for having us. I'm Christina Dorobek, and work here at Groma, leading the investor relations team. And for those of you who don't know Groma, we are also a proud member of SPOA, and we are really a real estate meets technology company. And so we focus on the small cap multifamily asset class right now here in Boston, meaning sort of 2 to 20 unit buildings, non-amenitized, located, you know, in dense urban cores like Greater Boston. And right now we own about 55 of these buildings with a tech advantage strategy, meaning we've built a real estate operating platform and prop tech platform that allows us to acquire, upgrade, and operate these buildings really, really efficiently. So some exciting ways to sort of unlock potential in this asset class. And as you can imagine, owning 55 buildings in the greater Boston area, we've worked with lots of buyers and sellers who have been, as Amir mentioned, in the process of doing tax advantage sales. So whether it's a 1031 transaction, a DST transaction, a 721 UPREIT transaction, and we've also fielded many questions about tax advantaged sales processes on behalf of our investors. So excited to talk to you a little bit about the opportunities out there and the offerings and services Groma has.
Great job, Christina.
Yeah, I guess I took our entire Groma intro.
No, that was perfect.
Well, Brian, you know, you will have opportunities to speak, so don't worry about that. No problems there. So I was wondering if you could please tell us a little bit more, or as much as you'd like to tell us, about what a 1031 exchange is and what an UPREIT is. I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, and Brian, maybe talk a little bit about what, do you want to talk a little bit about what an UPREIT is first? Sure. And then we'll tackle 1031 and DST, or you want to do it in reverse order?
That works. Perfect. So for those unfamiliar with the REIT, it's a real estate investment trust. It typically owns a diversified portfolio of assets. For Groma, it's a diversified portfolio of the small unit count multifamily assets in Greater Boston. It's typically open-ended vehicle. And what a 721 UPREIT is where the REIT will purchase the property that the owner is selling, and the seller will receive shares of the REIT at the value of their property sale in lieu of cash, or a combination of REIT shares in combination with cash. So what this allows for is the seller to take advantage of the 1031 tax deferrals and receive REIT shares, providing liquidity over time. So they may, say, sell a portion of their REIT shares in 2 years. At that point, they would pay taxes, and then they may keep some of the REIT shares in the REIT and continue to defer those taxes. So what it really does is provide tax advantage strategy, whereas they get REIT shares and then they no longer have to own and operate the building itself. And then as it relates directly to TOPA, which is as we talked about earlier in this presentation, an amendment that may get passed, it may not. But what an UPREIT offer presents is a type of offer that is highly likely to be matched by a tenant organization.
Highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely. Little misspeak there. So it allows a potential seller to sell to the REIT and not have to go through the risks and extended timeline of a potential TOPA, which not only increase risk, timeline, it also may increase cost. So that's a quick overview of UPREIT. Happy to dive into it a little bit more, or if Christina, you would like to add anything?
No, I think that's a great overview of UPREIT, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Is if TOPA gets passed into law, the tenant associations need to put together an offer that is substantially material to the offer that's on the table. And as Brian was mentioning, because you're getting a tax advantaged REIT shares essentially instead of cash, it's very unlikely that a tenant association can put together a substantially material offer. So there's potentially some advantages if TOPA gets passed. Amir had a good plug. Make sure you go to SPOA's website and reach out to your representatives. A 1031 transaction, many of you may already be familiar with. So 1031s were actually part of the 1921 Revenue Act, and it was less about land to land transactions then. I think it was actually more land to livestock transactions. And originally they had to be concluded in 1 day period of time. Now, there's been obviously updates to the tax code since then, and many of you may be familiar with what a 1031 is as we all know it today, which is sort of a like-kind real estate transaction that allows you to sell your investment property, take those proceeds and invest them into a new investment property, tax deferred. There's a lot of pros to 1031s, and I think Demetrios, you'll probably talk about some of them from the landlord perspective and how it can help small property owners sort of grow into it. So I'll let you chat about sort of that piece of the benefits of 1031s, but they give sellers a tax deferred process to buy a new building. And some of the cons, just to highlight a few, are that there are very tight timelines. So no longer 1 day. Now you have 45 days to identify a replacement property, and then 130 days post identifying your replacement property to complete the transaction. I think Amir, please jump in if you have anything to add. But I think one of the big concerns, if TOPA did pass, is that that's going to potentially put a lot of risk at both sides of the 1031 process, where you have really tight timelines on the 45 days and 130 days. And if you're buying another multifamily property, you have tenant associations on both the sales and purchase side of things. There is another structure that we'll talk about, and I'll probably pause after I give the lead in just to Amir, let you tee up some additional questions. But there's another process called, another way, tax advantage sales tool, I should say, called a DST, which stands for a Delaware Statutory Trust. And that allows sellers to take their 1031 proceeds and invest it into a DST, a Delaware Statutory Trust again, which can own a diversified portfolio of multiple assets and has some potential advantages both from a TOPA perspective, but also for any sellers who might be looking to get out of active property management, want some additional diversification. And so we can talk, Amir, again, when there's time, about some of the DST programs that we've done on behalf of our investors and some of the pros and cons of UPREITs, traditional 1031s, and DSTs. But I figure that's a pretty good high-level overview to start.
Christina, no, I thank you for that. And I give you credit because when I was formulating questions, you already started talking about what I wanted to ask in your overview. Toward the end, I was going to say, okay, what about the DST? And you went there automatically. So no, that was very thorough. I appreciate it. Demetrios, I will turn it over to you to get your perspective about the pros and cons of these different options and to explain them further.
Hey, thanks, Amir. So I think that, if you look at the profile of a landlord and how they grow their portfolio over time or how they manage their properties over time, usually what you'll see is that a landlord would buy maybe its first 3-family. I think the average landlord in Massachusetts, they buy their first 3-family or multifamily at the age of 52 years old, right? And so then they started maybe acquiring other properties. And usually what it starts with is a simple value add, right? And they reposition the asset, they make it better, they gain their helmsmanship, they understand it better. And once they've optimized that property, oftentimes, especially after equity's built in it for a few years, they want an opportunity to maybe trade up. So usually you're seeing, say, a 3-family go to maybe 2 3-families, or maybe they buy two families, and they're kind of scaling up and then repeating that cycle. What a 1031 does, which is really nice, is allows the landlord to gain more skill sets and kind of expand their skill sets at a faster pace because they've already maximized their original property, or they've done as much as they can there. So that 1031 is a very, it's a great vehicle for lots of landlords to continue that path unencumbered without paying taxes. So what I think it does overall, in the greater good, is it improves the housing stock because there's less impediments to moving capital around, if that makes sense to everybody. So you're not losing as much, but landlords can be more strategic. The other thing that I like about the 1031s is that it can be done and moved into any other state. So if a landlord's now 52 and maybe they're, looking at closer to retirement, 63, 65, they could go down to another state that they might be retiring in and move those proceeds down to where they're closer to their property without the ramifications of taxes, and then having properties in another state, and then having to worry about, having a property manager and long distance management. So the 1031 is an incredible thing for real estate. And I think overall, if across the country, it does a great service for the overall housing stock of America in multiple asset classes. As far as like DSTs go, I think those are awesome. And 721s are certainly something that I think provides, there's just a bundle of different sticks of things that you can do as a landlord. And many landlords are not aware of that, as they kind of go along, maybe they've done it 15, 20, 25 years, and they're just tired of, fixing toilets and cutting lawns and dealing with all kinds of necessary repairs. And they want to kick back. I think that, the DST and the 721 is another way to go. The other thing another way that, a lot of landlords go is they'll take a 1031, they're in a residential property, but they'll move to a commercial asset, which is less labor intensive. So overall, these are all great products. Now, I think Christina did a great job on illustrating all those, but it's a lot of information for sure to take down at once. And what we did on our Boston Pads website was we put the 1031, the DST, and the 721 in kind of very simple terms so you can read them there all at once, because it's a load to comprehend. But I think that, once you're educated on those, a landlord or an investor can go in many, many different directions. So I think that's probably, where I'd stop there and hand it back to you guys.
Just a potential clarification when we were talking about the timelines, it is so complex that it's easy to even make mistakes as I'm explaining it. When I was talking about the 45 days, I think I said 130 days. It's actually 135 days. That's 180-day total time frame, 45 days to identify a replacement property, and then 135 days post that. So even people who are working with all of these tax advantaged products all the time can make slips on the numbers. So appreciate the call out to both the Boston Pad site. We have upreit.groma.com if you want to go and sort of see some specifics there. I agree, visual could sometimes be helpful in breaking down what are three very complex transactions.
The visuals are like, I have to look sometimes at the visuals myself, Brian and Christine, just to look at it and go, okay, here's the difference between a DST and a 721, because landlords will call me, I'll be working on something else, like, tell me about the 721, and I'm like, oh, hold on a second. And so it is, well, I think it's not something that a landlord does every day or everybody does every day in their course of business. So it's great to have references to look at that. But overall, the benefits of them, I think, are fantastic. And I think that it serves a landlord well to look at those, especially, you know, when it comes to maybe changes in lifestyle, changes in location. All kinds of family factors can play into that, where they can inure the benefits of owning real estate, but without all the headaches.
Yeah, agree. We call it the 3 T's: tenants, toilets, and taxes. So, if you want to get away from the pain of that, you know, DSTs or UPREITs can be really great options. Amir, we'll hand it back to you to MCS.
No, you're all doing great. I appreciate it. I was wondering about the 1031 exchange process. My understanding was that in the past, it was simpler to essentially swap one property in one location for another property in a different location. My understanding now is that the government has made it tougher. In other words, if you're going to do the exchange, property A has to be more similar to property B in the exchange process. And some people think that it's going to become more challenging over time because the government wants its revenue, and there might be more limitation placed upon this option. Have you heard anything about that, or any thoughts on that in general? Anyone?
I have. I've heard of California trying to place restrictions on 1031s. And so it sounds more like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but your capital can never leave, right? But your taxes will always stay there. And look, and I think there may be some rumblings about it in Massachusetts, and I think that would be bad for the overall housing stock of Massachusetts. I think that, you know, if there are certain states that are growing like tumbleweeds, I think that it serves our government well to look at what are the policies that are creating rapid growth there. And, you know, if capital's going down to certain states, you know, I think that's probably hats off to that state, if that makes sense. So I think everything matters now where there's hyper competition between states. And I think that the restricting 1031s within our own state, I think could actually slow down our housing stock, reduce our options, and diminish capital, because capital needs to flow. Any barriers to, you know, capital moving in a city to improve it, I think is not, it doesn't serve it well. So let's hope that doesn't happen here in Massachusetts. But, you know, we have to be vigilant about such things.
And Amir, you bring up a great point that it's always changing and it's very complex. So as a small owner or a small property owner, it's very important to work with the experts, whether it's a broker like Demetrios, who really understands the 1031 process. You need to work with a qualified intermediary as it relates to where the money goes. It needs to go into an escrow account. You can't take it directly. And then the buyer is also very important because of the tight timelines. It's important to identify a qualified buyer during the sale process to make sure there's a strong probability of closing. Especially in today's interest rate environments, where financing can be a little hairy at times. I think all cash buyers are definitely
preferred
if you're in a 1031. So really making sure you're working with the right people and the experts in the space.
Yeah, hit the nail on the head. Make sure you have a great qualified intermediary, you know, your tax advisor, great broker. Even in the current legislation, there's plenty of room for foot faults, probably intentionally. And yes, Amir, I think that even at the federal level, there's usually talks of figuring out how to sort of close the tighten the 1031 process. So we do keep.
Well, it's good to know. Yeah, it's good to know. And I appreciate your comment. It is important to talk to the right people and refer to the right people who are up to date with present regulations so that they can guide you around various obstacles. Also, I'm just curious because we are throwing a lot of information, a lot of great information at people today. And some of our viewers may not have heard of what we're talking about. So, you know, I don't want to be too repetitive, but could we just recap, if we just focus just on the 1031 process first, could we just recap what the pros and the cons are?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, Amir, it might be helpful. We could walk through sort of a case study of one of the 1031 into a DST that we've done with investors here at Groma, if it would be helpful to sort of talk through a live case study. But
That would be great. Go ahead. Sure. Go ahead.
yeah, so maybe we'll do that first, and then Brian, we can talk through pros and cons. So we had investors, and I'm going to go back to Groma 2 DSTs. So we've done 3 DSTs so far on behalf of our investors, and I'll talk through a case study of our second one. So we had investors that had a commercial property in New Hampshire. So Demetrios is talking about sort of the ability to do 1031s cross state lines. It was a family property, and they had different sort of investment goals long term. So they wanted flexibility. You know, some people, I should say, they owned the property in an LLC, and so some members of the LLC wanted to stay in real estate. Others wanted to be able to have more flexibility over a few years, and so the opportunity to do an investment into a DST and then, actually UPREIT post DST, which Groma offers, gave them more flexibility. And we'll talk through all of the puts there. But essentially the timeline would be they, in August of 2022, sold their commercial property. They had about 2.5 million of proceeds. And as Brian mentioned, they put those proceeds with a qualified intermediary. So one of the first areas of potential pitfall is don't take any of the proceeds yourself. That needs to be held in escrow with a qualified intermediary. Then within 45 days from the sale of that commercial property, they needed to identify their replacement property. There's actually 3 different ways that you can identify replacement properties. This group used the 3 property rule, which meant they identified 3 potential properties. And if you were doing a DST, you treat a DST as an individual property. And so as you're going through the sales process, you could actually list, a actual property that you're looking at, and then you could list a DST as a backup, as a second one, in case, as Brian mentioned, for some reason, the exchange property transaction fell through for some reason. So they listed Groma's properties under the Groma's DST, I should say, under the 3 property rule. And then from that period, Groma then had acquired the assets. We acquired them as the Groma REIT, and we were able to upgrade them to our Groma grade. So again, this is sort of bringing all of our buildings onto Groma's tech platform. We integrate smart home technology that allows us to manage them remotely. And we were able to do all of that before putting them in the DST. So that had a really big benefit to investors, because oftentimes renovation capital into these buildings can be treated as boot, which means it's taxable. And so because we could do those upgrades as the Groma REIT before putting the buildings into the DST, we were able to actually provide some added tax benefits for our investors. So once they'd identified the properties, we had 135 days. So 180 days total, 45, 135. The investors had 135 days to actually purchase the membership interests of the DST. So from October 15th, which is when Groma had the 3 properties in Fort Hill sort of under agreement from the REIT, we then had time to move them into the DST, and the investors, well within their time frame, actually purchased their membership interests November 1st. So sold their property in August, identified their replacement property 45 days later, and then well within the 135-day window, closed on their replacement properties, essentially purchased membership interests of the DST in November. So hopefully that I'm with you, Demetrios, that we'll have a visual of this that we can send as a follow-up if anyone's interested, just to sort of show the timeline. But hopefully that provides a useful case study, and worth calling out as well that they were actually able to sort of take their 2.5 million of proceeds. They had about 33% debt. I don't think we've actually talked about this yet, but one of the requirements when you're doing a 1031 is to have replacement debt. They were actually able to put a little additional leverage. So we did about 50% debt on this DST. And so took 2.5 million of proceeds into a 5.5 million value of a DST, and now have, 7 multifamily units, so commercial to multifamily, in the Fort Hill area, which is an area we really love in Greater Boston. So hopefully that helps give a little bit of an illustration of both the timeline and the flexibility that this type of structure can provide, from, moving from New Hampshire to Massachusetts, moving from commercial to multifamily, and up leveling the investment amount.
Yeah, great.
Do you want to hit the sort of general pros and cons?
Yeah, that sounds great. And again, I think it's really helpful to illustrate examples here. So I'll try and explain this with like a real life example. So I look at 1031s in kind of 2 different buckets. One, and I'm sure Demetrios has worked with numerous owners and sellers who have taken or utilized the 1031 program to incredibly grow their portfolio over time. So they can buy, renovate, increase the value of the property, 1031, and just continue to expand the real estate portfolio. But we also work with a number of sellers who maybe they own 1 3-family in, say, East Boston. They bought it for $100,000 35 years ago. And because of depreciation, their basis may be $0. It could even be negative. So when you go to sell that property for, let's say, $1 million in 2024, you would be paying capital gains taxes on that entire $1 million, not just the difference between what you bought it for in, call it 1980, and what it's worth today. You'd be paying taxes on that full $1 million. So what a 1031 really provides is tax deferrals. I would say that is definitely the #1 pro. Additionally, it allows you to trade into a different type of asset, which may be less labor intensive, such as a multifamily property. And then as it relates to tax deferrals, it's a really useful estate planning tool. So if you are looking to maybe pass down a legacy asset to a family, maybe they want to manage a triple decker, maybe they live in a different state and it's not for them. When you do eventually pass away and the asset is passed along to the estate, there's actually a reset in value. So that asset you bought, call it 30 years ago, for 100 grand, it's depreciated down to 0. When you do pass it down to your kids, the basis is reset to, call it $1 million. So when you do estate plan, pass down the asset, and they go to sell the property, they're only paying the taxes on the gain from when you pass. So it could be 0, it could be a little bit more. So it's a great estate planning tool to kind of 1031 grow your assets. The cons are,
well, and just
go ahead.
Just to piggyback on that point, this is where the expression swap till you drop comes in. So one of the other pros is that this is an infinitely repeatable process.
Right.
So you can legitimately 1031, 1031, on and on until it's a little bit morbid, but until you pass away.
Right.
I'd say one other pro, and then I'll let you take over
Sure.
on cons, is that in Massachusetts, this also allows you to defer the millionaire's tax. So one other sort of, in addition to deferring capital gains, you can also defer the millionaire's tax.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great addition. So the cons really are, it is complex. Obviously, there's a number of experts in the field that can help property owners work through the process. There's great resources on SPOA's website as well to kind of dive into the details. But you can make a footfall, so to speak, where maybe you don't hit the timeline, maybe you don't put the proceeds in a qualified intermediary. Oftentimes we're working with sellers who may have already identified the property they're buying. So it's really important for them to sell the asset that they're selling on a relatively tight timeline. And when that occurs, not every transaction goes through, so that may fall through. You're under contract on a different property you're buying. You may be stuck in a position where you actually cannot buy the property and you default on the contract and lose your deposit. That's obviously a very high risk. Or maybe the sale process just doesn't go as smoothly on the buy side, and you end up not identifying the appropriate amount of properties over a certain amount of time. So I would say the majority of the cons take place during the transactional process. If there's footfalls done there, and then I would say another one is that if you do need liquidity and you need the cash, maybe the dividends or the income from the property isn't right for you at that time. So if you need a larger cash lump sum at the time of the sale, it may make sense to pay the taxes and just take the hit.
Yeah.
Those are the two main cons, I would say.
Yeah, and you can reverse 1031. You can go in the opposite direction too. And I have done 1031s where I had it actually expired because I didn't see any good deals out in the marketplace. Now, had I known about a DST, forever and a day ago, I probably would have listed that as my safety blanket. Most of the landlords that I talk to that do the DST, to your point, Brian and Christina, is the third option. They put this is my DST option, almost better than nothing, and so that's kind of a security blanket that I think a lot of landlords like. And the other thing that I would mention on those is that there's different offerings. There's different offerings in different asset classes for DSTs and 721s, and there's different regions, Sunbelt regions, New England regions, core asset regions, small multifamily. There's all these different classes of things, of offerings that a consumer can look at, or an investor that wants to switch from a multifamily to another can look at, because they may feel confident in that sector. And then those often get filled and a new one comes up. So I think it's important for the audience to look at different ones and also feel comfortable, because you want to have some confidence when you're buying into something like that. So there's quite a few different ones out there, but I think that they're just all viable options. You just find the best one that makes sense for you.
Yeah, I think Demetrios, that's a great point. And sort of one other, if we were going to do pros and cons of DSTs, Amir, since we did pros and cons of traditional 1031 transactions, I think one of the big pros of DSTs is that it can eliminate some of, or provide some, I would say eliminate a lot of the timeline risk, because the DST already exists. And so you're basically taking, one of the potential transactions that could go haywire on that timeline, and, stabilizing it. So one pro is that it is a less risky from a timeline perspective transaction. I think one of the other big benefits, Demetrios, what you were talking about, is you can actually take your proceeds. So we'll talk about Groma investors who had 2.5 million. If they wanted to split that 2.5 million across multiple DSTs, you can.
Correct.
So you go, some portion in a multifamily DST, some portion in an industrial DST, and so you can sort of diversify. You can put some in Massachusetts, some in Phoenix, and so the DST structure also gives you some flexibility in that. And you can also take additional proceeds. So if you did a traditional 1031 and you happen to just have additional exchange proceeds, because for whatever reason you actually downsized and bought a slightly smaller building, you can take that excess capital and put that 50,000, 100,000 into a DST as well. So DSTs are a very flexible structure. I would say the cons are, especially for a lot of hands-on property managers, right. You're giving away some of your control. DSTs tend to be high fee structure programs, and oftentimes you're forfeiting some of the hands-on control and ownership. So some of the cons on that. Anything that I missed you want to
I would say one other con might be a strong term for this, is that they tend to be lower cash yield, so you might not be getting the dividends you're used to for a multifamily property that maybe you're actively managing. So what you get is, as Christina mentioned, something that's managed by someone else, and because of that, the dividends tend to be a little bit lower than what an owner may be used to. Additionally, they tend to be more core type assets because there are some rules and regulations around how much capital improvements you're allowed to make during ownership. They tend to be like your core property that you're not going to add a ton of value through renovations and value add and hands-on improvement. It's more about just operating it smoothly, keeping it leased up, and collecting the check in the mail every quarter, every month.
Yeah.
The best way I explain it in a very simple way, you guys did a great job with that. The best way I explain it to landlords in a very simple way is you're hiring a property manager. They just happen to be spread out, and you might not ever get to meet them. You might stop by the property, you might not. And Christina's point, that's literally going from a real estate triple decker owner operator, if you will, to mutual funds in real estate, if you think of it that way. So, but someone's got to go fix the toilet. Someone has to fix the garbage disposal. Someone has to repaint the lines in the parking lot. Someone has to maintain the roof. Someone has to cut the lawn. Someone has to make those phone calls, and someone else is doing that. So you're freeing. So, and again, depending on your lifestyle, your age and all that, I mean, it could be the perfect solution if you've made enough money and it's time to go enjoy yourself and have a little bit better return, I think, than say what you were, like what you get in I mean, if I was looking at it, Amir, from what kind of return should I expect? I want a little bit more than bonds, right? Because I could just put them in bonds. If I'm just getting bonds, okay, well, I mean, I'm getting about that. But if I can do a little bit better than that, then it's awesome.
Yeah, well, and I think, Brian is talking about distributions traditionally being, lower for a DST. I think that is a comparison that at surface level, the distributions feel lower, but when you actually factor in some of the tax advantage and the fact that the underlying asset is appreciating,
Right.
It ends up being oftentimes a really good investment. Groma right now has our third DST open, which is 4 properties in Charlestown. And the only reason I call this out is that our DST structure is sort of a nice middle ground in the sense that we might be the smallest DST out there, but it gives potential investors a little bit of a blend of you can actually come to Charlestown and we'll walk you through the units. You can
you can come to our offices.
Yeah,
and
right.
Manager.
You can kick the tires a little bit, and
Right.
we try to keep the fee burden much lower in our DST programs because we have a tech advantage strategy and end up compressing operating expenses significantly. That helps us keep the fee burden low.
Right.
So there are not just Groma, there are other what I would call boutique DST offerings that can be a nice middle ground from an institutional DST that might be high fee and you're never going to get to go tour the property to again what I would call a boutique DST offering that can provide maybe a better middle step from somebody who's a first time passive operator.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I've looked at different DSTs and I've looked at different 721s and you can do some really great Zooms and they'll pull up their entire spreadsheet. They'll show you all the operational costs. Now, having been or still am a sophisticated landlord, I can say, well, that line item doesn't look that right. So are you sure you guys are right on that? But there, so and you get to question it, and they can give you 5 reasons why. I go, okay, that makes sense. I didn't think of that because where that is in that area, that's more expensive than what it is here or what the landlord's used to. But you can question those things as you're looking to participate money into those vehicles. And I think that's another thing that makes it so when a landlord can feel comfortable going, okay, this is a great operator. They've created some operational efficiencies, technology management and or otherwise. Okay, great. And the last thing that I would add, there are some landlords that are actually, they've owned real estate. They've gotten really successful in other industries and they're making more money in other industries. And so the real estate itself, while it has inures a lot of advantages, tax and or otherwise, to go into something else that really their most important thing is how they're making money per hour and actually managing that property and spending the time on the phone calling, maybe the Wi-Fi is out in the building and they've got to call Verizon, you're on for 2 hours. That landlord's losing money while they're on the phone. So it's a time money value thing as well for more successful landlords as well, where this actually becomes, you know, an opportunity for them to make more money in other endeavors and stick to their core competencies.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I'm wondering too, just a couple of things, and I think Christina touched on this earlier when she was talking about property owners giving up control. Property owners are used to being fiercely independent as business owners, and I'm thinking if they were to consider one of these options, they would have to give up that independence and control. So the first question is, how would one encourage them to make that transition step by step? And number two, in the process of 1031 exchanges, I'm sure that we have a lot of owners out there, even with all of these threatening proposals on Beacon Hill, they feel rooted in Massachusetts. They want to stay in Massachusetts. So even if they were doing a 1031, how could we encourage them to stay here rather than going to another state and to keep investing in Massachusetts? Whoever wants to take it can take it.
I'm giving that one to Christina.
Which one? First, I was smiling, Amir, during your question because my father is an 83-year-old landlord in California, in Denver, and when I say landlords, some landlords don't like to give up control, I'm thinking of him. Like he still likes to go to every unit and could confirm the square footage himself. So, but I also think it's what keeps him young. The pitch I keep giving to my dad, and I'll give the personal one first, and then I'll try to make it more useful for everyone else. But I'm like, don't you want to spend more time with your grandkids? That's the pitch to him. I have 2 daughters.
Great pitch.
And so, I've been trying to personally talk him into giving up a little bit less control so that he can spend more time actually enjoying the life that he's worked really, really hard to create. So I think that, it is, and Demetrios, you talked a little bit about this, like at points of life transition, letting go of some of that can actually give you, to your point, time value of money can give you time.
Purpose too. So,
and purpose in different ways. So, I think that is a big one. I think, vetting your partners, and making sure you feel comfortable with the team that's going to be managing the properties, and, making sure you feel comfortable with who you're working with is another big piece that can help sort of put people at ease when they're giving up a little bit of that, hands-on control. And so even whether it's, people at Groma or other boutique DSTs or other larger DSTs, talk to the people who are going to be operating the property, get on a Zoom call, like look through the operating expenses.
Yeah, agreed.
In that. And so I would say, those 2 pieces of, think about what your time could be spent doing, and maybe there's other things that will bring you joy, and, make sure you're picking a partner that you feel really confident and comfortable working with, because that'll put you at ease, help you sleep better at night. On the Massachusetts piece, I mean, Brian, I would say, and Demetrios, rent growth.
Yeah, I can take a quick stab at it. So we love Boston. It's our backyard. We are currently only investing in Greater Boston because of driving factors like employment. It's an educational hub. It's a great lifestyle. You have a ton of amenities in the area. What Boston, I think, historically has really struggled with is making development easy. So as you look at market fundamentals and you look at supply demand, Boston currently and historically just hasn't supplied enough housing units, which has increased rent across the board. It's going to continue to increase rent. While here at Groma, we're very pro-development because we think it's great for the city. It allows more people to live here. It allows more people to live here at a lower cost burden. But as you think about Groma as an owner and an investor, when you don't develop new housing units, rent's going to continue to grow, and it increases revenue for the asset that you may own. So over the short term, midterm, long term, rent will likely to continue to go up in Greater Boston because development's so difficult. And then there's just so many demand drivers that'll keep people here. There are certain things, Amir, as you mentioned in Beacon Hill, that we don't necessarily agree with, which may change things a little bit, but at the same time, we're very bullish on Boston long-term and love it. I personally love living here, and we like investing here.
Yeah, I would say one of the other sort of factors that we look at is also climate concerns. And on a 10, 15 year time horizon, the Northeast is very geographically well situated to manage potentially increasing temperatures, whereas you look at markets like the Sun Belt, I think of like Phoenix. I want to say like projections are 20, 30 days that are in a 365-day window that are going to be above 120 degrees. And at some point, that could make a market less appealing. And so one other sort of pro for the Northeast.
I appreciate that. I think it's also, is it reasonable to say that with the potential threats that are on the horizon on Beacon Hill, rent control being one example, if property values go down, that also affects how you would enter into a 1031 exchange? I mean, these other options that are out there would still be, for the most part, negatively impacted if bad legislation gets passed in Massachusetts. And so I think it's reasonable to say, number one, that people still have to look out for that and plan accordingly. And number two, even if you're tired with the day-to-day responsibilities of running a property hands-on, this gives you all the more reason to join SPOA and to fight for your property rights, because the 1031 exchange, the UPREIT, the DST, I mean, these are not necessarily, these should not be viewed as an escape or an exemption from bad policy. They can be affected negatively just as well. So it's not just a matter of exercising your property right if you enjoy the hands-on aspects of property management. Even if you want to exercise those other options, you still have to fight for your property rights and fight against bad legislation. So I think it's all interrelated, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think very well said, Amir.
And shout out to SPOA, and Demetrios and Chris Lehman on our team is very involved in SPOA. We think it's a great organization, and as you mentioned, it allows for a lot of small property owners to have their voice heard, and really impact Boston for the better and housing market for the better.
Yeah,
I also want to thank Chris for everything that he does. Demetrios, closing comment?
Well, before we close, bringing up Yankee ingenuity and kind of that tougher, we've got some tough, really strong people here in New England, and they've been through a lot of winters, and they're, and Christina, talking about your dad, I totally get that, and wanted to do everything. But, at my age and having gone through many, many cycles of real estate in the city of Boston, I hear about a lot of landlords breaking arms, breaking legs, falling down, snow shoveling. And, you got to be careful, too, as you get a lot older, the stuff that you were doing at a property when you were in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, even your 60s, you may not want to be doing. I have some landlords that are still doing stuff like that in their 80s, and and you worry about them a little bit. You're like, what are you about? You have, and they have capital, they've done really well, but they still have that I've got to do everything. And so letting go sometimes is for the greater good before something happens, if that makes sense. So while it warms my heart to see it, I sometimes worry, as you get into those later years, trying to do some of the heavier stuff at the properties that at minimum should be outsourced. Now, it can be completely outsourced through the DST and the 721 and a 1031 into a different property. But at minimum, for our landlords out there that might be pushing the wick, you can send it out to third parties to get it done. So that's all I wanted to say for that. As far as, Boston, I think it's a phenomenal city. yeah, I mean, I think we are going through, Brian said it really, really well. We're going through some, legislative challenges, I think, although I think, the pendulum swings one direction and it swings another. I think hopefully we get back to more sensible pro-growth policies and incentives that, I think every single, landlord that I talk to wants affordable housing for, as do I, for our citizens. But I think it comes through supply and not taxation and other methods. I think it's, streamlining the barriers, getting rid of a lot of the barriers to development, to have that pro-growth policies. And we do, although we have limited land, we do have neighborhoods that are underutilized. I think we have to look at that, rezone some of those things, rethink Boston, and develop so we can give affordable housing to all our citizens. So I think it comes through supply and not, other measures.
Thank you, Demetrios. I appreciate that. And I just want to remind everyone that you'll be able to find visual aids for the purpose of reviewing these ownership management strategies in the email that we're going to send with a link to this episode. You'll also be able to find them on our website. Speaking of our website, I want to remind all of you to go to SPOA.com/join and to make a donation to SPOA, because we really need your help. Having said that, I want to thank our wonderful panel once again. In the near future, we'll be back with another episode. Until then, my name is Amir Shahsavari, and I wish you well.